Under the golden haze of a late autumn afternoon, the small frontier town of Clearwater lay quiet, except for the distant creak of a windmill and the low rumble of a wagon wheel dragging along the dirt road. The town looked as though time had forgotten it. Wooden storefronts leaning slightly, paint faded by the sun, and a single street stretching between the saloon and the general store. Dust swirled gently in the wind, clinging to boots and skirts alike. Life moved slow here, and people spoke slower still, measuring their words like they measured the grain they bought, carefully, with little waste. It was into this stillness that she arrived. A young woman, no more than 20, dressed in a faded brown dress that had seen too many washings, her bonnet pulled low to hide a face marked by travel and worry. Her shoes were worn near through, each step raising a small puff of dust behind her. She carried no suitcase, only a small bundle tied in a checkered cloth. Everything she owned, it seemed, held in her trembling hands. As she walked down the main street, the townsfolk peered out through their windows or paused on porches. Their quiet curiosity sharp as the chill wind that blew off the plains. Travelers were rare in Clearwater, and lone women rarer still. She could feel their eyes following her, their whispers soft but cutting. She stopped in front of the general store, her reflection faint in the dusty window pane. Inside, an older woman with silver hair was sorting bolts of cloth. When the young woman stepped in, the doorbell jingled softly, and the chatter outside seemed to hush. The older woman looked up, her expression cautious but kind. "Can I help you, miss?" The young woman hesitated, clutching her bundle tighter. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice small but steady. "I can clean, sew, cook, anything honest." The storekeeper studied her for a long moment, then shook her head with quiet pity. "Work's scarce, child. Folks around here already have what help they need. You might try the ranch out west, belonged to a cowboy by the name of Mr. Harlan. He's got more land than he can tend to alone. Maybe he could use an extra hand." The young woman nodded, whispering a small thank you before stepping back into the street. The mention of a ranch sparked something, hope or fear, she couldn't tell which. The walk would be long, the sun already low, but she had nowhere else to go. She set off westward, following the trail that led out of town. The land stretched wide and open, golden fields giving way to rolling hills. The air smelled faintly of sage and dust, and every so often, a hawk circled overhead. As she walked, she thought of the road that had brought her here, of the people she'd left behind, the hardships that had driven her from her home, and the dreams that had once felt close enough to touch. But dreams faded fast in the world she'd come from. Hunger and grief had a way of stripping away what was soft inside a person, leaving only what was necessary to survive. By the time she reached the ranch, the sky was painted in streaks of amber and violet. The house stood tall on a rise overlooking the valley, a solid two-story structure built from thick timber, its porch lined with lanterns that glowed faintly against the coming dark. Fences stretched out in every direction, corralling the distant shapes of grazing cattle. It looked peaceful, yet something about it carried the weight of loneliness. She hesitated at the gate, smoothing her dress with nervous hands before walking up the path. The boards creaked beneath her boots as she stepped onto the porch and knocked softly. For a moment, there was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling through dry grass. Then the door opened, and a tall man filled the frame. His face was sun-worn, his jaw darkened with the shadow of a day's work. A wide-brimmed hat sat low over his brow, and his eyes, gray as storm clouds, narrowed slightly as they met hers. "Yes, miss?" he said, his voice deep and measured. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice not to shake. "I heard you might be needing help around here. I can work for fair wages. I'm not afraid of labor, sir." The cowboy leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, studying her in silence. The evening light caught the edges of his face, showing lines carved by sun and solitude. "You came all the way out here alone?" She nodded, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. "I didn't have much choice." Something in her tone softened his expression, though only slightly. "You said you can cook and clean?" "Yes, sir. I can tend animals, too. I grew up on a farm." He looked past her then, at the empty trail stretching back toward the town. The sight of her, so small against the endless land, seemed to stir something unspoken in him. He took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair before setting it back. Finally, he said, "I don't need a servant." The words hit her like a slap, though he hadn't meant them cruelly. Her lips parted, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Oh, I understand. I just thought—" He interrupted, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "What I need is a wife." The air between them went still. The wind quieted. The distant hum of crickets seemed to fade. She stared at him, not sure if she'd heard right. A wife? The word hung heavy, impossible. He didn't smile. He wasn't joking. "I got land, stock, a home, but no one to share it with. I've had my fill of loneliness out here, and I figured two people working side by side might stand a better chance than one." Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "No," he said simply, "but I reckon I'd like to." For a long moment, neither moved. The lantern light flickered across his face, and she saw no mockery there, only a kind of weary honesty. Still, the thought of saying yes, of trading one kind of uncertainty for another, terrified her. She had come looking for work, not a husband. But the world was cruel to women alone, and her choices had grown thin as winter corn. He stepped aside, holding the door open. "You can come in and rest if you like. Supper's on the stove." Her voice trembled when she spoke. "And if I say no?" "Then you keep walking," he said softly. "No harm done." The wind caught her bonnet tugging at its strings. She hesitated, her eyes flicking from the open doorway to the fading road behind her. She could walk away, back into the cold and the dark, or she could step forward, into a life she couldn't yet imagine. For the first time in days, warmth touched her cheeks. Not from the lanterns, but from something like hope, flickering deep inside. Still, her heart warred with fear. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because when you spoke just now, asking for work, your voice shook, but your eyes didn't. And I figure that means there's strength in you. The kind of man don't find often." She felt her breath catch in her throat. The last light of day slipped behind the hills, and darkness began to settle across the land. The cowboy's hand still rested on the door, waiting, and there she stood, half in shadow, half in light, caught between the life she'd known and the one being offered to her. The night wind carried the scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low across the plains. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorway. Then, just as her fingers brushed the frame, he said quietly, "If you come in, miss, there's no turning back to the way things were." She froze. The wind howled once more, and the lanterns flickered, throwing their light over both of them. The choice hung in the air, fragile, uncertain, as the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain came softly at first, pattering against the porch roof as if urging her to decide. She stood there, the bundle in her hands growing damp, her heart caught somewhere between fear and a strange pull she couldn't quite name. The cowboy waited, silent and patient, his hand still on the open door. Finally, she took a slow breath and stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a low creak, sealing her off from the cold open world outside. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and stew. The floorboards beneath her boots were clean but worn, the kind that spoke of years of quiet living. A fire crackled low in the hearth, throwing soft light across the room. Everything inside looked sturdy, plain furniture, a few old books, a worn hat hanging on the wall. But there was a stillness to it, the kind that came from a man used to silence. He motioned toward the table. "Sit, you look half frozen." She obeyed without a word, setting her small bundle on the floor beside her chair. He ladled stew from a pot on the stove, the smell rich with meat and herbs, and placed a bowl before her. "Eat," he said. "You've come a long way." She murmured her thanks and took a small spoonful, though her hand still trembled slightly. It had been 2 days since her last proper meal, and the warmth spread through her like comfort she hadn't known in a long while. The man sat across from her, his gray eyes steady as the firelight danced between them. After a while, he spoke, You got a name? She hesitated. Clara, she said softly. Clara Wynne. He nodded once as if tasting the sound of it. Harlan, he said. Elias Harlan. They ate in silence after that, the kind of silence that wasn't quite awkward, just careful. Every sound seemed louder than it should be. The pop of the fire, the scrape of the spoon, the steady rhythm of the rain outside. When she finally set down her bowl, Elias leaned back in his chair. Wasn't expecting company tonight, he said quietly, much less someone asking for work this far out. Clara folded her hands in her lap, her gaze on the flickering fire. I didn't plan on it either, she admitted. I left home after my folks passed. The farm was taken soon after. I've been moving west ever since, looking for some place that'd take me in. Most towns don't have much use for a woman on her own. He nodded slowly as if her story was one he'd heard before, or perhaps lived himself. The world's been hard on folks these past few years. Drought took half the land round here. People left what they built, chasing promises that didn't come true. Something in his tone carried weight, a quiet ache she couldn't quite name. You were one of them? She asked carefully. He looked toward the window, where rain streaked down the glass like thin silver lines. No, he said finally. I stayed. Had too much here to walk away from. Clara didn't press further, though she could feel questions rising. There was more to the man than his quiet strength, something buried deep, something heavy. But she didn't yet have the right to ask. He stood then, pushing back his chair. You can take the spare room for the night, he said. We'll talk more come morning. If you're set on staying, there'll be plenty to do. Thank you, she whispered, as she followed him down the narrow hallway. Her eyes caught small signs of a life lived alone. Dust gathering on an unused rocking chair, a faded photograph resting on a shelf, the faint scent of tobacco that lingered in the air. He stopped at the last door, opened it and stepped aside. Not much, he said, but it's warm. The room held a simple bed, a washstand, and a single oil lamp. The sheets were clean, folded neatly. She turned to thank him again, but he'd already gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. That night, Clara lay awake long after the fire had gone out. The roof whispered under the steady rhythm of rain, and the world outside felt impossibly far away. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken, that she had come seeking a servant's position and instead been offered something else entirely. The thought of being a wife to a man she'd met only hours before felt wild, almost foolish. Yet something about him, his calm, his honesty, the steadiness in his voice, had made her pause instead of run. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pale sky and a land washed clean. When Clara stepped outside, the world felt different. The air was crisp, and the scent of wet earth filled her lungs. From where she stood, she could see the wide field stretching into the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle and broken only by a line of dark trees along the creek. Elias was already at work in the yard, mending a fence post. He looked up when she approached, tipping his hat slightly. Morning, he said. Morning, she replied, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I wasn't sure where to start. He set down his hammer. You can help with the animals if you're up for it. Feed's in the barn. The day passed in quiet rhythm. Clara worked beside him, learning the lay of the land and the pattern of chores. She brushed the horses, gathered eggs, and carried buckets of water from the well. Though her arms ached and her dress grew dusty, she felt a strange peace in the work. The ranch, though lonely, had a kind of calm she hadn't felt in years. Every now and then Elias would glance her way, offering a word or two of guidance. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice carried warmth that softened the roughness in him. She noticed small things, the way he handled the animals with quiet care, the way he paused sometimes to look toward the hills as if remembering something lost. By the time the sun began to dip again, the sky was painted gold, and they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee between them. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Clara said softly, You live out here all alone? He nodded. 5 years now. Used to have a hand to help, but he moved on. No family? He shook his head. Had a brother once. He went east to find work. Haven't heard from him since. His tone held no bitterness, only acceptance, the kind born of long solitude. She hesitated, then asked, And before that? He glanced at her, his jaw tightening slightly. Before that there was someone, but she's gone. Clara's heart tightened at the quiet finality in his words. She didn't ask how or why. Some wounds she knew didn't need reopening. The silence stretched between them, not cold but heavy with things unspoken. The ranch creaked softly in the evening wind, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Elias set down his cup. "You should know," he said. "I don't make promises easy. What I said last night, I meant it. I don't need a servant, but I won't push you into something you don't want. You're free to stay as long as you like, work for fair pay, and leave when you wish." His words surprised her, their gentleness cutting through the tension she'd carried since stepping onto his porch. "Why offer me that?" she asked quietly. He looked toward the fading light. "Because everyone deserves a place they can stop running." The simplicity of it struck her. For a moment, she couldn't find her voice. That night, after the chores were done and the lamps dimmed, Clara sat by the window in her small room, staring out at the vastness beyond. The moon hung low over the plains, silvering the fields in its glow. She thought of her old life, the hunger, the sorrow, the cold nights sleeping under strange roofs. This place, for all its mystery, felt different, but she couldn't ignore the unease that lingered deep inside. There were questions she hadn't asked, about the woman he'd lost, about the loneliness that filled this house like a ghost. She could sense it in the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, or stared too long into the distance. As she turned down the lamp, a sound drifted from somewhere down the hall, a door creaking, soft footsteps, and then the faint thud of something falling. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She listened, holding her breath. The house went silent again, as if nothing had happened. She waited a long time before lying back down, her eyes wide in the dark. The walls seemed to hum faintly, the wind slipping through unseen cracks. Out beyond the window, lightning flashed far off on the horizon, followed by a low roll of thunder. Sleep came slowly, uneasy and light, and when she finally drifted off, she dreamed of a woman's voice calling faintly from somewhere deep inside the house, a voice she'd never heard, yet somehow recognized. When morning came, the sky was gray again, and the air thick with the scent of coming rain. Elias was already gone from the yard, his horse tracks leading toward the hills. Clara stood on the porch, the wind tugging at her shawl, her gaze following the trail he'd to it. She didn't know yet what secrets this land held, or why the silence in that house felt heavier with each passing day, but she could feel something stirring beneath the calm, something waiting to be found. The morning air carried a bite, sharper than usual, as Clara stepped out of the house to start the chores. The sky hung low and heavy, gray clouds pressing down on the open fields. The wind stirred the long grass, whispering through the fence posts like a voice half heard. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked toward the trail Elias had taken hours earlier. His horse's tracks had already begun to blur under the shifting dust. He hadn't said where he was going, only that he had business beyond the ridge and would be back before sundown. It wasn't unusual for him to ride out alone. She'd learned that much in the few days she'd been there, but something about this morning felt different. He'd left before dawn, quiet and tense, his eyes shadowed as if weighed down by thoughts he didn't care to share. Clara had wanted to ask what troubled him, but the words wouldn't come. She was still learning the shape of his silences. Inside, the house felt emptier than usual. The sound of the wind in the chimney filled the quiet, and the wooden floorboards creaked softly under her steps. As she moved about her work, something kept drawing her eyes to the closed door at the end of the hallway, the only one Elias had never opened or spoken of. The first time she'd noticed it was her second day in the house. She'd gone searching for spare linens and found herself standing before that door, its brass handle dull with age. When she'd reached out, a cold draft had slipped from underneath, faint but real, carrying with it the smell of cedar and something older, like dust and memory. She'd stepped back quickly then, telling herself it was none of her business. But every time she passed it, that same feeling returned, a quiet pull like a whisper in the dark. By midday, the clouds had gathered thick, and the wind had turned restless. Clara finished tending to the animals and brought the laundry inside before the rain started. The house darkened early, the storm rolling in heavy across the plains. She lit a lamp, its flicker throwing long shadows against the walls. That was when she heard it again, a soft sound, faint but distinct, coming from down the hall. It was like a slow scrape of wood followed by a dull thud. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The wind howled outside, but this sound came from within. She took a cautious step toward the noise, the floor groaning beneath her weight. The sound stopped. Her heart pounded as she stood before the closed door. The brass handle glinted faintly in the lamplight. She told herself it was probably just the storm shifting the frame or an old shutter banging loose, but still, she couldn't bring herself to move away. When Elias returned that evening, soaked from the rain and quiet as ever, she said nothing of what she'd heard. He looked worn, his hat dripping and boots caked with mud. After supper, he sat by the fire, running a whetstone along his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. The air between them felt heavy, thick with things unspoken. Finally, Clara gathered the courage to ask, "You went far today?" He didn't look up. "Far enough." "You were gone longer than usual." "Had business with a neighbor over the ridge," he said shortly. Something in his tone made her uneasy. She set down her sewing and watched him for a moment. "Is everything all right?" He paused, the knife halfway through another stroke. "There's trouble brewing in these parts," he said finally. "Cattle gone missing, fences cut, folks blaming rustlers moving through the hills. I went to see if anyone's been near our land." Clara's heart quickened. "Did you find anything?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but I will." She wanted to believe him, yet she noticed the way his eyes lingered on the window, scanning the darkness beyond as if expecting something, or someone, to be there. The storm had eased, but the wind still moaned low through the eaves. That night, after Elias retired to his room, Clara found herself awake again, listening. The house seemed alive with sound, the tick of the clock, the sigh of the beams in the cold. But beneath it all, she thought she heard another noise. Faint, rhythmic, almost like footsteps moving softly along the hall. She held her breath, straining to listen. Then a whisper of movement. Wood against wood, a slow creak, the same sound she'd heard before. Her eyes darted toward the end of the hallway, where the closed door sat shrouded in shadow. For a long moment, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of light coming from beneath it. Then darkness again. She didn't sleep after that. In the morning, Elias noticed the tiredness in her eyes but said nothing. He was quiet all through breakfast, his mind clearly elsewhere. When he stood to leave, she finally spoke. "Elias," she said carefully, "that room down the hall, what's in there?" He froze, his hand still on the back of his chair. "Why do you ask?" "I heard something," she said. "More than once. I thought maybe—" He turned to face her then, his expression unreadable. "That room stays closed," he said, his voice low but firm. "There's nothing in there that concerns you." Her pulse jumped at the edge in his tone. He must have seen the fear in her face because his voice softened a little. "I'm not angry, just— Don't go near it, Clara. Some things are better left alone." With that, he took his hat and stepped out into the morning fog, leaving her alone once more. The days that followed passed with an uneasy rhythm. Elias grew quieter, more withdrawn, and Clara could see the worry in his eyes when he returned from his long rides across the ranch. Once she caught him standing out by the corral at dusk, his hand resting on the fence rail, staring off toward the horizon as if waiting for something to appear. She wanted to ask what haunted him, what secrets weighed on his heart, but every time she tried, he turned away. The distance between them grew, not cruel but cold. Meanwhile, the nights brought new unease. The noises from the closed room came more often now, soft at first then louder. Once, she swore she heard a faint tapping, steady and deliberate like someone knocking from within. When she told herself it was her imagination, the sound had stopped, almost as if it had heard her. Then came the night she found the footprint. It was just outside the back door, pressed deep in the mud after a light rain, large, heavy, and fresh. She'd thought it was Elias's at first, until she saw the direction it faced. The print wasn't leading toward the barn or corral. It was leading to the house. That evening, when Elias returned, she showed him the mark. He crouched beside it, frowning, his eyes scanning the yard. "Tracks lead from the woods," he said quietly. Whoever it was didn't stay long. Her stomach tightened. "You think it's the rustlers?" "Maybe," he said, "or someone looking for what they shouldn't." He stood and looked toward the tree line, his jaw tightening. "Keep the doors locked when I'm gone. And if you hear anything strange again, don't open that door." No matter what, that night the air felt heavy and close, the wind stilling completely. Clara lay awake listening to the silence, her heart beating hard in the dark. Then, softly, it began again. The scraping, the low thud, the faintest hint of a whisper. She sat up, clutching the blanket. This time it wasn't just sound. She could feel it. The vibration through the floor, the faint movement in the still air. her eyes fixed on the end of the hallway, where that old door stood. The light under it glowed faintly again, a weak yellow shimmer like lamplight through fog. For a long time, she didn't move. Then with trembling hands, she reached for the lamp beside her bed and stood. The wooden floor groaned under her feet as she took slow, quiet steps down the hall. The closer she got, the colder the air became. When she finally stood before the door, she heard it again. A soft rustle, a breath, something shifting just beyond the wood. Her voice came out a whisper. "Who's there?" Silence, then faintly a reply. A sound too soft to be clear, but enough to make her blood run cold. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was in that room. Clara stumbled back, her lamp trembling in her grip. The flame flickered wildly, throwing frantic shadows across the wall. She turned and fled back toward her room, slamming the door and pressing her back against it, her breath ragged. Outside, thunder rumbled again across the plains, distant but growing closer. And somewhere, beneath the roll of the storm, she thought she heard the faint echo of a voice, a woman's voice calling her name. The next morning broke gray and silent, the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful but watchful. The wind had stilled, and the ranch sat under a strange, heavy stillness that pressed on Clara's chest. She hadn't slept a minute. Every time her eyes closed, she heard that voice again, soft, almost kind, whispering her name from somewhere deep inside the house. When the first light came, she forced herself to rise, though her limbs felt weak and her thoughts tangled. Elias hadn't returned from his ride the night before. His horse, still saddled, stood in the barn, restless and uneasy. That alone set her heart pounding. He never left his horse untended. Something must have gone wrong. Clara hurried to the edge of the yard, scanning the hills beyond the fence. The land stretched empty and pale, only the faint outline of distant trees marking the horizon. No movement, no sound, just the wind sighing faintly through the grass. She told herself he'd gone to town, maybe caught by weather or nightfall. But deep down, a chill whisper reminded her of the footprints, the strange noises, the door he'd told her not to open. She'd tried to believe his warning was out of caution. Now she wasn't so sure. By mid-morning, a low mist rolled in, soft and thick, blurring the line between land and sky. Clara worked to keep herself busy, sweeping floors, mending clothes, feeding the animals, but her mind kept drifting back to that door. Every time she passed the hallway, her steps slowed, her eyes drawn to the faint outline of it against the dim wall. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. By noon, she could stand it no longer. She told herself she only wanted to check, just to make sure no one had broken in, no animal had found its way inside. The thought of waiting alone for Elias while that strange presence lingered behind a closed door made her feel trapped. She lit a lamp, though the daylight still filtered through the windows, and walked slowly toward the end of the hall. Her footsteps echoed softly in the narrow space. The air grew colder the closer she came, carrying a faint scent of damp wood and lavender soap, an old, familiar scent that made her chest ache for reasons she didn't understand. The brass handle was cool under her fingers. For a long moment she stood still, her pulse thudding in her ears. Then she turned it. The latch clicked softly and the door creaked open. The room beyond was dim and still. Dust hung in the light like tiny flecks of gold. The first thing she noticed was the rocking chair by the window, frozen mid-sway as though someone had just risen from it. A quilt lay folded neatly on the bed, its pattern faded but carefully kept. There were books stacked on a small table, a half-burned candle beside them, and on the dresser, a framed photograph. Clara stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The photo showed a woman in a pale dress, standing beside Elias in front of the same house. They were younger, smiling faintly, his arm around her shoulders, her heart squeezed. So this had been her room, the woman he'd lost. The one he never spoke of. Everything inside felt untouched, preserved as if time had stopped the moment she was gone. The air carried a lingering sweetness, something that made Clara's throat tighten. She set the photo down gently, meaning to leave. But then she saw something strange near the far corner of the room. A small trunk sat there, its lid slightly ajar. Inside she could just make out fabric, a dress maybe, or linens. But on top lay something else. A letter, its edges yellowed with age, addressed in a delicate hand. Curiosity and dread warred inside her. Slowly, she reached for it. The letter was short, the ink faint but readable. Elias, I'm sorry. I tried to stay, but the silence here is too much. Something in this house isn't right. You hear it too, I know you do. Don't come after me. The signature was smeared, the last line barely legible. Clara's breath caught. The letter wasn't written by a woman ready to leave her husband out of choice. It sounded like someone afraid, someone running from the same whispers that now haunted the hall. She stepped back, her hands trembling. The house groaned softly, as if shifting under her weight. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. She froze. Elias was still gone, and yet she could hear footsteps upstairs, slow, heavy, deliberate. Clara's lamp flickered. She turned toward the hall, the sound growing louder, closer, until she could feel the vibration in the floor. Elias? She called, her voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then, faintly, the sound of a door closing, somewhere overhead. Her pulse raced as she backed toward the main room. The wind outside began to rise again, rattling the shutters. The air felt charged, alive, humming with something unseen. She reached for her shawl, ready to run if she had to, but the front door wouldn't budge. The latch held tight, as though locked from the outside. The storm broke suddenly, rain slashing against the windows, thunder rolling close. The house seemed to tremble under it. Clara pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breath. Then she saw it. Movement at the top of the stairs. A shadow. Tall. Still. Watching. She lifted the lamp. Her hands shaking so badly the flame wavered. Who's there? The figure didn't move. For a heartbeat, the lightning flashed bright through the window, lighting the stairwell, and the shadow vanished. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. When the door finally burst open, she screamed, but it was only Elias, dripping wet. Mud on his boots, his expression drawn tight with worry. Clara, what are you doing in here? She turned toward him, breath ragged. There's someone in the house, she gasped. I heard footsteps upstairs, and that door you told me not to open, Her words died when she saw his face. He went pale, his jaw tightening. You opened it. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I had to, she said. I thought, Elias, there's something here. That letter. He stepped forward and gripped her shoulders, his eyes sharp with something close to fear. You shouldn't have gone in there, he said. You don't understand what that room holds. Then tell me, she cried. What happened to her? What happened in this house? The thunder cracked again, shaking the walls. Elias turned away, running a hand through his hair. She was my wife, he said quietly. Her name was Lorna. She died here. Clara felt her stomach twist. The letter, she said she left. He nodded slowly. That's what she wanted me to believe. I found her 2 days later down by the creek. The water had risen from the rains. I think she'd gone out there in the storm, maybe trying to leave, maybe just to escape what she thought she heard. What she thought she heard? Elias's eyes flicked toward the ceiling. There's something about this place, he said. It was built on old ground, native land. My father bought it cheap because no one wanted it. He said it carried stories. I didn't believe him. Not until after she was gone. The lamp flame guttered, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. The wind howled through the cracks, and the faint smell of smoke filled the air, though the fire had long died. Elias's voice lowered. Since that night, the house hasn't been right. Doors open on their own. I hear her sometimes, calling me, asking why I didn't save her. Clara's eyes stung, but she forced herself to speak. Elias, it's not just in your head. I heard her too. I thought I was dreaming, but he looked at her sharply. You heard her voice? She nodded. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. Then it's starting again. A loud crash sounded from above them, cutting him off. Both of them froze. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor echoed through the ceiling. Elias grabbed his rifle from beside the door, checking the chamber. Stay here, he said. Clara shook her head. You can't go up there alone. He didn't argue, but the look he gave her said he wished she'd stay behind. Together they climbed the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. The air grew colder with every step. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead, dim, empty, lined with doors. The farthest one was open. Elias raised the rifle and stepped forward. Clara followed close behind, clutching the lamp. When they reached the doorway, she saw the rocking chair moving slowly back and forth, though no wind stirred the air. The photograph she'd seen earlier lay shattered on the floor. Lorna, Elias whispered, his voice breaking. The chair stopped, and from somewhere beyond the room, deep in the walls, came a sound, soft, rhythmic, Almost like breathing, Clara's lamp flickered again. The light dimmed, then steadied. Elias turned toward her, his face pale as bone. "Get back downstairs," he said. Before she could answer, the window slammed open with a crash. Wind and rain burst into the room, whipping the curtains wild. The lamp flame went out, plunging them into near darkness. Clara reached for Elias, but the storm swallowed her voice. In the flash of lightning, she saw him standing near the open window, his eyes fixed on something outside, something she couldn't see. Then, faintly, from the roar of the wind came the same voice she'd heard before. Clear now. "Close, Elias." He turned slowly toward her, his expression unreadable, the rifle lowering slightly as if in a trance. Clara's breath caught. "Elias, don't..." But he was already stepping forward into the darkness, toward the voice that shouldn't exist, and behind them. In the flicker of lightning, the rocking chair began to move again, slowly, steadily, though no one was there to set it in motion. The storm that had swept across the plains the night before finally cleared by morning, leaving the air fresh and cool. The land stretched endlessly, glistening under the soft sunlight that crept over the ridge. The town of Willow Creek slowly woke to life again. Roosters crowed, wagons rattled down the dirt road, and the scent of coffee drifted from the small diner near the livery. Inside the farmhouse on the edge of town, silence lingered a moment longer before the clatter of dishes broke it. She moved quietly around the kitchen, her hands steady now, though her heart still carried the weight of everything that had happened. The last few weeks had tested her in ways she'd never imagined, more than the hunger that once drove her to that ranch gate, more than the fear that filled her when he'd said those words. "I don't need a servant. I need a wife." She hadn't known what kind of man he truly was then, but she did now. The cowboy sat near the window, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The lines on his face looked softer today. He wasn't the gruff, guarded man she'd first met. The land had a way of humbling even the strongest, and after the storm and all they had faced together, something between them had shifted quietly, something that didn't need words to be understood. He turned as she placed his coffee down, their eyes meeting for a moment longer than they used to. There was no awkwardness anymore, only understanding. She wasn't the frightened woman who'd come knocking at his door, asking for work with her voice trembling, and he wasn't the man who saw her as an interruption in his quiet, lonesome life. They had both changed, by the land, by circumstance, and by each other. The cattle had survived, though many were scattered across the valley after the storm. The barn roof needed mending, the fences were half gone, and the fields were still soggy from the rain. Yet somehow, amidst all the ruin, she felt peace. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere, not just as someone passing through or begging for a chance, but as part of something real. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the fields, she stopped near the stream. The sky was wide and open, the same way it had been the day she first arrived, yet everything felt different. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth, and the world seemed full of possibilities again. She turned to him, her voice soft but sure. "You could have sent me away that day," she said. "But you didn't. Why?" He glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "Because I saw something in you that I'd lost in myself," he said quietly. "Hope." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You gave me more than a roof," she said. "You gave me a reason to keep trying." He looked away toward the horizon. "Maybe that's what we both needed," he murmured. "Someone to remind us that even out here, where it's rough, lonely, and unforgiving, life can still surprise you." The wind picked up again, rustling the grass around them. They walked on in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts. When they reached the fence line, they began to work together, fixing what the storm had broken. The rhythm between them felt easy now, natural. Each shared glance, each quiet word carried more meaning than before. By evening, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. The farmhouse glowed warmly in the distance, a symbol of everything they had built together, something fragile but real. He leaned against a post, wiping the sweat from his brow, and watched her as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She caught him looking, and for the first time she didn't look away. "Looks like we're finally getting this place back together," she said, smiling faintly. He nodded. "We are, piece by piece." She looked at the horizon again, her voice soft. "Funny thing," she said. "When I came here, I thought I just needed work. I didn't know I was looking for something else." He tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "And what was that?" She met his gaze steadily. "A home." The word hung in the air between them, simple yet heavy with meaning. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "Then I hope you found it," he said finally. She nodded, her throat tight. "I think I have." That night, the town lights twinkled faintly in the distance while the ranch rested under the wide, star-filled sky. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sounds of crickets and the gentle creak of the porch swing. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. She sat near it, sewing quietly while he read a worn letter he'd kept tucked in his coat for years. It was a letter from his brother, written before the war had taken him, words about home, about never letting the land or loneliness harden his heart. He folded it carefully and looked toward her. The firelight reflected in her eyes, and in that moment he knew that Letter's words had finally made sense. He rose and joined her near the hearth, his hand brushing against hers. "The ranch will need a lot of work before winter," he said. She smiled gently. "Then we'd better get started early." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You say we like you plan on staying." She looked at him, her expression calm and certain. "I do." Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of the river flowing over stones, steady and sure. The night wrapped around them, not in silence but in peace. The fears that once kept her awake now seemed far away, replaced by something deeper. A quiet trust that whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning, when the sun rose again over Willow Creek, the world felt renewed. The church bell rang faintly in the distance, calling folks to the square. The streets filled with wagons and laughter, the town alive again after the storm. She stood on the porch, watching it all, her hands resting on the railing. He came up beside her, hat in hand. "We'll go into town today," he said. "Need to get some supplies." She nodded, smiling. "And maybe a new dress?" He raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "You planning something?" "Maybe," she said softly, glancing at him. "Depends on what you say when we get there." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "Guess I'll find out soon enough." They walked together toward the wagon, the morning sun warming their backs. As they rode down the familiar dirt road, past the open fields and wildflowers, everything felt different. The journey that began with a shaky voice asking for work had turned into something neither of them had expected. A story about finding courage, forgiveness, and a home in the most unlikely place. The road ahead stretched far and open, like life itself, uncertain but full of promise. And as the wagon rolled toward the heart of Willow Creek, their laughter mingled with the wind, carrying the sound of a new beginning. The cowboy glanced over at her once more, his voice gentle but sure. "You know," he said, "I was wrong that day." She looked at him, puzzled. "About what?" He smiled faintly. "I said I didn't need a servant. What I should have said was I needed someone like you." She didn't answer, but her eyes said enough. The wagon kept rolling through the sunlight, leaving two sets of tracks behind them, leading not just toward town, but toward the life they had built, one choice, one day, one heartbeat at a time.